You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count.
Okay, welcome back to the Deer University podcast. Today we are going to attempt to again tackle to some degree sometimes a contentious topic, but certainly a complicated topic. And this will be our second part relative to some indirect effects of supplemental feeding. And so I am joined today by Steve Damaris and Marcus Lashley, and graduate student, outstanding graduate student, Beau Navarre, who just defended his thesis on this very topic. And so Steve and Marcus, I will pass to you. I know y'all were very critical in the design of this project and concerns that our state wildlife agency, Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, had on what are some of these unintended consequences of supplemental feeding, and could it be that concentrating animals for feeding, can it degrade the plant community or affect habitat quality? So do y'all have anything to say kind of about the history and genesis of the project?
Well, yeah, I'll throw out my first commentary is it's a very contentious issue, and among biologists, you know, there's a lot of passion involved with what we do, and passion tends to come out when ethics and opinions are involved with things as opposed to just straight up facts. And so supplemental feeding is one of these contentious issues that some people have just dyed in the wool against it, and it's unnatural, and therefore it shouldn't be done. And then there's a group of biologists that say, hey, we live where it doesn't rain, and we need to try to stabilize the food supply for our deer population, and supplemental feeding is about the only way we can do it. And then we're kind of in this area here in the southeast where there's plenty of rainfall. It does rain, oftentimes too much. And, you know, so we have plant communities that are different than some of the places where supplemental feeding is much more of a standard operating practice. So here, a lot of us would like to say, hey, we're going to do it all natural, and we're going to apply our habitat management techniques. I mean, Marcus, you've been critical in helping us in the past develop some really great habitat research projects that show how we can improve habitat quality significantly by doing burning and what time of year to do burning and stump sprouting and all these things that really we can do things. We can make habitat better, but that doesn't mean that every property and every landowner can, within their world, make that habitat better. And so there's just a lot of interest. And our state agency did a survey of their DMAP cooperators, and over half of them practice some form of supplemental feeding in the state. And it's been increasing in the last 10 years. So it's an issue that needs to be talked about. And whether you're for or against it, it needs to be talked about. And that's what we do, is we talk about the science and apply it to management.
Yeah, Steve, I thought you were going to have a great sound bite there for a minute. I thought you were going to say we can make habitat happen. So that would, I'm going to keep that and say it some other time, I guess. But yeah, I agree with you, Steve. This is one of those things that really opened my eyes when you guys led that survey of landowners in the state. And I forget what the exact numbers was, but it was 70+% of the group that you surveyed, right, were using feeding to some degree.
Well,
So,
a little over 50%, like 54% were feeding.
okay.
I think you're remembering 71% of them had corn involvement in
Oh,
their
okay.
feeding.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. So, okay. So, yeah, more than half the landowners are using feeding, and more than 70% of those that are feeding are using corn as part of that feeding program.
And you know,
So,
an interesting thing. I'm sorry, I'm jumping back in here, but it's interesting. You know, a high percentage of people are feeding. A very high percentage of those people, when you talk to them, they say, "Well, we feed because our neighbors feed." It's
mhm,
not because we think it's the best thing to do, but it's like defensive. Like my neighbors are feeding, and so therefore they're going to pull the deer off of me during the hunting season, and so therefore I'm going to feed so that
mhm.
they don't get all the deer.
And what you end up with is most people are feeding, which
Yeah.
I guess to get back to the point, that was kind of eye-opening to me that it is something that we need to address from a scientific standpoint. It makes perfect sense why agencies would want to address this. Are there any unintended consequences to these feeding programs? It's obviously being widely used among landowners, at least within Mississippi, but from our own experience and probably the knowledge of the many of the listeners, we know that it's pretty widespread across most states now in the Southeast. So, uh, yeah, I definitely think it's a worthwhile question. And I thought we put our heads together and came up with some really interesting ways to try to evaluate that.
So in that regard, we more or less thought of, and maybe there's more, this is just what we thought about and relative to what we could sample, three different mechanisms or three different pathways to measure this. So now let me introduce Beau Navarre. And Beau, if you don't mind, since you so articulated this so well a few hours ago in your public thesis defense, why don't you talk about those three different pathways that you endeavored to measure?
Yeah, and I'll kind of start with the main driver behind those mechanisms, which is really, when we're putting food out on the landscape in certain areas, you're going to attract deer as well as any other species that can eat whatever feed that is to that area. So that's kind of the main driver, kind of behind these three effects. And so we came up with the three mechanisms: herbivory, trampling, and seed dispersal. And starting with herbivory, there's been a little bit of previous research that's looked a little bit into it, but nobody's really looked at it and how it's directly affected the plant community. Um, and right along with that, trampling is again kind of driven by these large herbivores being attracted to these sites, and that increased foot traffic is going to possibly have an effect as well. And for anyone that's familiar with kind of some of the agricultural side of things, with livestock, there actually has been some research showing that, when you concentrate animals in an area, all that foot traffic is going to, one, remove your layer of plants, but also it can, cause soil compaction and erosion and other effects like that. And then lastly, going kind of into the seed dispersal a little bit, kind of not is directly related to large herbivores, but really kind of all the other species, including those large herbivores. But a lot of times we attract many bird species, lots of small rodents, raccoons, possums, all kinds of things to these feeders, and those are all dispersing seeds across the landscape. So if we're changing their behavior, then we could likely be changing where they might be depositing seeds on the landscape.
So, Beau, I will step in real quick. I think that's really interesting. I think you learned and educated all of us on this pretty well when you were going through the literature. Almost every study, if not every one, at least the ones that you reviewed, that have thought about the effects that feeders could have on plant communities have been related to just one of those mechanisms, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that was all pretty much on herbivory.
Yeah, so pretty much, even as scientists, we've kind of assumed that any negative, negative effect or effect on the plant community, or however you want to think about that, is stemming from concentrating mouths, basically intensifying browse pressure or whatever. And I thought that was really interesting. And one of the things that was really unique about your study, and one of the things I love about it, is that we sat down and put our heads together and tried to think of some other ways. Is there other ways, like you put, Bronson, earlier when you were talking about it, introducing Beau? Are there other ways that we could be affecting the plant community that aren't necessarily directly related to the mouth of deer?
And so, Beau, I think this will be obvious to most people, but it may not be to some. Generally, what do you mean by herbivory? I mean, what kind of assumptions do you have going into this? And Marcus alluded to this a little bit, but generally, what would you expect to find if you had a feeder that concentrated a lot of deer for a long period of time? What's kind of your hypothesis going into that?
So my hypothesis going into that is, if you're increasing mouths at these sites and you're increasing the amount of time that they're there as well, then you're probably going to be seeing more herbivory at those sites, because they're animals are there to eat feed, but they're very opportunistic, and they're going to take advantage of eating whatever's there. And if they're spending more time there, they're going to eat on other things as well.
And I think that's very reasonable to conclude, is that could happen given the right context. Yeah.
Yeah, along those same lines, Beau, and I don't know if this is where you were leading, Bronson, but if not, you can take the reins and go some other way. But another way, I guess you're concentrating the browser and increasing the general level of browse, but you also could be doing some other things to the herbivore, concentrating that activity that might affect plants. You want to talk about any of those other things, like a shifting diet, or I think that's
so
what a lot of the literature has focused on, right?
Yep, a lot of the literature is focused on concentrating the herbivores, but also looking at diet change within those herbivores. So some of the previous literature and kind of some of the ecological theories supported that if you give these herbivores high protein food source, or any kind of food source where they're meeting some of their nutritional needs with that, then they will spend more of their time focusing on higher quality plants as they go about their normal browsing. And that's just kind of to try and maximize their nutrition. They can do that. And there, have been several studies that have supported that. There have been several studies that have kind of shown the opposite, showing that, when these deer are eating sometimes these high energy food sources and things like that, they can shift to a more fibrous based approach for the plants that they're choosing. to balance out some of that highly digestible feed, and help, their ruminants, so help that process and things like that. So it's been, there's evidence supporting both, and I think it's, can be context dependent, extremely context dependent on a lot of things, but a lot of the research has focused on that diet shift, and it hasn't been directly correlated with any, direct, effects on plants, but the kind of idea that most people carry with that is that if those deer shift from kind of a more broad diet and focus on particular very high quality plants, those high quality plants might suffer in that environment, and vice versa with, if they're focusing on those fibrous plants, then those fibrous plants might begin to suffer.
Beau, is another way to say it, to kind of draw parallels with terminology a forester may use, or Steve and I use a lot with high grading, a deer population or the buck segment of the population. Are you potentially high grading the plant community? You're going to put a lot more pressure on the most palatable plants.
Absolutely.
And so the concern is, over the long term, is that those are going to be, the abundance of those plants will be diminished over time.
Yep, absolutely. And we can actually kind of draw parallels from this. I know when William McKinley was on, he referenced some plants that, just due to high deer densities on the landscape, we see some plants that now only exist in areas where deer can't access them. So, that's definitely a very plausible assumption.
Yeah. So, Beau, what did you have to do? Something I know, just in our conversation here, I've mentioned a couple times, I've said, given enough time. How did you go up setting the project up to where you would have an adequate sampling design, so you'd have good representation spatially, but you'd also have enough time to where you could see some effects years down the road? And as much as we've loved having you, Beau, and I think as much as you've loved being here, you kind of said you didn't want this to be a 20-year project. So how did you reconcile that issue?
Yep. So, kind of to get at that time aspect, we split it up into two different study designs. We had what we call the manipulative experiment, where we actually went out and set up fed sites and control sites, and did pre-treatment data to kind of set the baseline for these sites before we applied any treatment. So we were really able to control and look in more detail at some of these mechanisms. But I've only been here a couple of years, so that was only able to last a couple of years. And then in order to look at kind of the more long-term aspect of it, we used a retrospective experiment where we looked at longer-term fed sites that had already been established prior to me starting, 5 to 7 years old, and looked at those to look at that more longer-term aspect of some of these mechanisms.
And you mentioned a control, Beau, could you explain what a fed site versus a control consisted of?
Absolutely. So, the basis behind this is that, you see a lot of variation in plant communities based on a lot of different factors. Your soil, your overstory timber is going to have a big effect. If you've done any burning, kind of all that stuff is going to have a lot of effects on your plant community. So what we did is we set up paired sites. So we had two ecologically equivalent sites where we had very similar plant communities to start with, and then we would randomly assign a feeder to one of those, so that we then had a fed site, but we also had a paired control site to compare that to, and draw conclusions off of. And we also did that with the retrospective as well.
So the control is the unfed site that, other than the feeder, it's in the same type of plant community.
Correct.
Okay,
And
so the context is the same ecologically in the habitat.
Yes.
and even I know with some of your approach, Beau, you confirmed that mathematically, right? You compared the plant communities between the pairs to ensure that there wasn't some difference already present,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yep.
then allowed us to know when you place the feeder in one of them that any changes are apparently due to the initiation of feeders, and then track that over time. So I think that was a very important part of the design for exactly what you were saying. I mean, even when you showed us the groups of plant communities a few hours ago, you could pretty clearly see the pairs grouping by property just because they're in different soil regions and they have different forest management practices ongoing and a lot of different things happening. So it's definitely a really important part of that manipulation.
And part of
Other
the context here, excuse me, Bronson, that we want to make sure people understand is there's feeding. There's a lot of different variations of feeding out there, and some states and some properties allow baiting to take place where you put feed out, you often an attractant like corn during the hunting season to alter the behavior of a target animal for harvest. And that's not what we were looking at here, right, Beau?
No, we wanted to look at supplemental feeding, which is, you know, objective driven on increasing nutrition for deer. And, so that means doing it year round. And the main goal of that is to increase nutrition for usually white-tailed deer.
So the idea is the feeding is going to alter the behavior of animals and bring them to a spot for a purpose. And did you document a change in behavior between the fed and the unfed sites, Beau?
Yes, we saw a pretty dramatic increase in the number of deer that we saw focused on these spots. But what might come as kind of a surprise to some people is, we had a even greater increase in use by species other than deer. And our number one user of these fed sites was actually raccoons. And by far, they were the most prevalent species that we saw across all our sites at these feeders.
Yeah,
So
that's exactly what I was going to say, Steve, when you so rudely interrupted me a moment. Just kidding. Um, was that might be something that people would wonder, what, of course, deer are coming to feeders, but for our study design, we wanted to prove that. We had to prove that are we having, more deer coming to the location around where the feeder is because we're looking at this effect of deer occupation on the plant community. So, Beau, you saw, of course, you did, and you documented it. You saw a big increase in the number of photos, time spent of deer at feeders versus at paired spots, ecologically equivalent spots without feeders. But man, oh man, you've got like two or more greater times the amount of non-target species that are coming. You mentioned raccoon. I know you don't want to get my temper up here, but you also saw a few pigs. Every
Yep, we
time you're
sure
feeding
did.
on the landscape, if there's pigs on the landscape, they are going to find it. What are some other critters you documented?
So we saw a pretty wide array of different species, and most of those are ones that are going to be utilizing that corn. So we saw a lot of birds, such as cardinals, crows, even had some bobwhite quail come by a couple times, turkeys, um, a lot of small rodents, mice and rats, possums, you know, a ton of different species.
yeah,
So,
just to I'm going to rudely cut you off real quick, Bronson, just taking after Steve here. But yeah, so I, I I think that was an important point. I wanted to circle back for just a second on it that you were making. It does kind of seem silly. We put feeders out to feed wildlife, and then voila, we see more wildlife. But it is important from an experimental context, especially with all these species that we aren't intending to feed, to quantify the magnitude of that change. And that's really important to put into context some of the other things that we're observing about the community and how it's changing. Because I wouldn't have, if you told me to say all of the species that would respond to the feeder, I'd have probably gotten a fair number of them. But if you told me to rank them in order of which ones would be the most common versus least common, I'm not sure that I could do that. And I don't think that I would have known what the magnitude of difference between being fed and not fed would have been. I know that I would have guessed it would have been a large effect, but from a research side, that's pretty important for us to quantify exactly how big is that change, when we're putting into context some of the other things we're trying to measure.
And so I think it set us up. I beat you to the punch, Steve. I think it set us up to, because of the response that Beau documented, and that there's such a drastic difference in the number of deer going to the control non-fed sites versus the fed sites, we felt good about there could be potential impacts on the plant community because of that.
Yeah, and one last little factoid to think about here is 75% of the critters that you photographed at the feeders were not deer.
Correct. Yep.
Three out of every 4 photographs of critters were not the intended species of interest for you. And in most of the cases, well, probably all of those cases, the critters that were there feeding were not critters that you wanted to be there feeding. The raccoons, the possums, lots of birds were involved visiting. And you might say, well, yeah, it'd be nice to feed birds. But now we one of our more recent podcasts was talking with our graduate student, Miranda Huang, who documented increased levels of aflatoxin on corn that she documented left in the environment for up to 3 days. It started becoming toxic to birds. So all these target animals are not ones that you would want to be spending money feeding, and in some cases you could actually be harming those species by allowing them to access certain types of feed.
So why don't we move into, Beau? What did you find? Why don't we start with the effects on herbivory? If you don't mind, maybe just generalizing what you found.
Yeah. So, kind of going back through those 3 mechanisms that we had identified, now that we have kind of verified that we do see that increase that we think might be driving these. Starting with herbivory, we looked at the amount of browse stems in correlation with these sites, and we actually saw that double, not only at our short-term sites, but our long-term sites as well. And we also looked at some of the plant groups within the community and the individual stem counts of those, and kind of following the same train of thought that a lot of the previous studies made, but didn't necessarily follow all the way through with. We actually saw an associated decrease in the number of vines at our fed sites. And just for people that might not be as familiar with plant communities, a lot of the vines that we actually had in our sampling were highly preferred deer forages. We have summer grape, poison ivy, greenbrier, and that group is heavily made up of those preferred deer forages. And so that mechanism we think, is pretty viable. Kind of going into trampling, and to me, when I started going through my literature review and everything like that, when I started here, it's kind of interesting to me that no one had really looked at the trampling aspect of it, because if you go out to a fed site, usually the first thing that you see is that, the first 4 meters or so are just bare dirt. And that's exactly what we saw at all of our fed sites. We saw a pretty dramatic increase in bare ground in year one, and that increase continued to go up into year two for our manipulative sites. And that if you really think about it, with the compaction and things like that, and other research, that's going to affect what can grow back there in the future. Not all plants are able to cope with factors like that. When you compact that soil, and when that feeder's there, there's probably nothing that's ever going to be able to recolonize that area, if that trampling and herbivory and all that continues in that area. And then, finally going into seed dispersal, again, we mentioned that, not only are we increasing use by deer, but all these other species as well. And we saw pretty much the same trend with the seed dispersal as well. We doubled the amount of seeds that were getting deposited to these fed sites when we were comparing them to our paired control sites.
So you found kind of the predicted impacts in all three mechanisms. You saw plant impacts from the herbivory, you saw trampling impacts where animals were trampling down the vegetation, and you saw seed dispersal increases associated with feeding. What about the overall impact on the plant community? Did you document an overall impact from time zero at the beginning out to 5 to 7 years? What happened?
Yeah, so we use an analysis that actually looks at every plant species and the counts of those species, and kind of going through it time-wise. Our pre-treatment data for the manipulative, we didn't have any difference in those plant communities. Going to year one, after the application of that treatment of a feeder at half of our sites, we started to see those plant communities diverge a little bit. In year two, that became even more extreme. And then when we compared that to the differences between our controls and fed sites in our long-term study, we saw that result become even more dramatic. And, just to get into a little bit more detail, I won't get too much into the stats, but with that analysis, you can have it tell you what aspect of the community is driving those relationships. And for the short-term study, the main driver of that relationship was the trampling and the increase in bare ground, and kind of the reduction of plant life right there around the feeder. But in the longer-term study, we actually saw that some species that are not browsed on by deer became more prevalent. And I don't know if we can really say that it's definitively this is what's happened, but kind of the thought is that, following along with where we've been going, that, all this pressure from herbivory and trampling, the plants that are going to be able to do better are those that are resistant to those factors. And the plant species that we picked up were ones that are more resistant to those factors.
Well, I think you made a good point, though, with anybody that has been around a feeding site, the thing that is immediately obvious when you get there is that there's a big old mud hole there if you're down in a wetland, or a big dirt hole if you're up in an upland. That's an obvious impact that you saw immediately on these. I think that is an interesting thing, that that is the thing that sticks out, and your data showed that at least early in the game, that really was what was driving the shift in the community that you observed. And even, when we started going into the longer term, the browsing, I guess from my perspective, I would expect that to be more of a longer term, so it's a more gradual change as you continue to elevate that level of browsing. You would over time lose species, but the big point is you have these initial effects from trampling, and then the longer term effects from browsing, and the reality is they're all interacting. And I think that's what you were kind of getting at right there. You know that feeding changed the plant community, and how much of it was associated with which factor is a little harder to tease out, but we know that all of them were plausible because they, what we expected to happen happened, and then the plant community indeed did change.
And then something, Beau, you really didn't set out to look at, but we know did happen is once you create all this bare ground, and if you were to stop feeding or move the feeder, what is more likely to colonize these big areas of bare ground?
Yeah, so we saw a little bit of a trend for this in our long-term sites too, but invasive plant species are really, have a good chance of being able to colonize these spots that have been disturbed over some of the native plant species, especially when you look at some of the side effects of trampling, not just with the increase in bare ground, but that soil compaction and things like that. If you look in previous literature, looking, at soil characteristics, a lot of times that's going to be very correlated with invasive plant species being more successful at those sites.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. As the probably out of the group, the plant nerd, I can speak up on that. Yes, a lot of our problematic invasive plant species are problematic and invasive for a good reason, right? They can tolerate a wide range of soil conditions. They produce a lot of seed that's valuable. They also tend to be species that are not very high on the browse list, and they're often really browse resistant. So you're sort of creating this perfect storm there where, we should expect that just intuitively. And then based on the literature, especially with some of the pasture scenarios with cattle, that's definitely been observed quite a bit.
And for the record, Marcus, people don't call you plant nerd. They just call you a nerd.
Yeah, I respond to any of those names. So.
Well, so, Beau, what do you tell people? Is supplemental feeding, is it going to harm the plant community? Can you give a yes or no? Or do we end up where we give the same response Steve and Marcus and I always give? It depends.
Yeah, I think we're going to be stuck with it depends. We've identified that all these mechanisms can happen, but the degree that those are going to happen in a certain landscape is going to be very context dependent. So yeah, right back to what should be the catchphrase for this podcast is it depends on a lot of different things.
Well, along those same lines, and maybe Bronson, I saw you were trying to say something, but what do you tell people if you're going to supplementally feed, knowing that the effects that might have might differ depending on your context? We've sort of laid out, you have these longer term effects from leaving a feeder in the same place, or the short term effects that you could get. What do you tell people if they're going to supplementally feed? Should they leave it there or should they move it?
So it really depends on the property, and I would say that for a landowner that if you leave it long term, like you were saying, you're probably you're going to have that trampling, but over the longer term, you might really start to see that herbivory start to really affect the plant community more and more as that time increases. On the other hand, if you move them around, that trampling, especially right there on the feeder, happens pretty quickly. So you're opening up that space. If you move around that feeder, you're just creating multiple spots that have now been opened up for invasion. So if, the prevention of invasive species, plant species is really important, I might advise that, a landowner just leave them in one spot and don't mess with them. If, a landowner has an area where they don't have a problem with invasive species, maybe move them around, try and spread that concentration of herbivory around a little bit. But, it's just, I think as a decision maker, you really just have to weigh out the possible effects and use your context along with that and try and make a good decision.
Well, Beau, you've done a real good job of clarifying things. I'm going to throw a little confusion in here, just in the nature of context discussion. Your mentor, Dr. Lashley, talks a lot about disturbance and disturbance ecology, and disturbance is a good thing in most contexts. Fire is a disturbance. We talk about positive effects of fire. We talk about disking as a positive form of disturbance to affect plant communities. And we've referred to the trampling as a disturbance. But now you're saying trampling in this context is not necessarily good. So help for those that might get confused, is there a good disturbance versus bad disturbance, and how would you qualify that?
So I think, when talking about disturbance, and really thinking about the ecology, a lot of times with some of these other methods that you mentioned with burning and disking and things like that, we are actually replicating these natural ecological processes that allow the natural plant community to do really well. Trampling, on the other hand, is a little bit different with that really high concentration of animals in a really small spot. Deer normally aren't going to behave that way. So, the conditions that you're creating with that disturbance are going to be different. So, you are removing the plants and resetting the plant community and things like that, but you're changing the recolonization potential of those fed sites with that soil compaction and things like that.
Pretty impressive, huh, Bronson? The way he
Yeah,
answered that?
Yeah.
we've trained him well. We've trained him well.
Yeah, I think the key thing is the way that it's affecting the soil structure, and a lot of folks out there in agriculture can probably relate to this. We deal with hard pan, or that soil compaction can cause issues, and sort of the same thing here. I think a lot of the issues are coming with the soil structure itself.
Beau, how would you rate, when I think about generalizing your findings and trying to think of instances where you may see less of an effect or more of effect, as you said previously, we do kind of have to provide a context for our situation, our study areas, etc. So one of those is how many deer you have. Do we have an abnormally high deer density, a very, very low deer density, or kind of average? The other would also be, in general, what was habitat quality? Did we have just excellent or average or below average on these areas?
So with a lot of our sites, we actually had really, especially relative to a lot of places, really high habitat quality. We had landowners that were doing timber harvests, pretty aggressive thinning, had really awesome prescribed burning regimes going on. And, I can attest through my sampling, having to walk through all of it, that the plant community was the understory plant community was doing awesome. A lot of times we were up to our chests wading through blackberry thickets and things like that. So, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the deer density. You have these herbivores that are eating plants, so the amount of herbivores that you have on the landscape is going to play a big role. But then also the amount of plants that you have on the landscape is going to play a big role too. So that's going to play a big part into your context. You might not see some of these, species richness effects or things like that, where you have individual plant species disappearing just because you're managing for that habitat correctly. You're going to have a lot more of them there. So
that's kind of an interesting thing to think about too, because as you improve the plant community, you reduce, the expectation of some of these effects, but probably also reduce the need for the gains that you would get from supplemental feeding itself as well at the same time as you improve the plant community.
Yeah, that's I think that's another side of the story there. And I guess the reason I asked that, Beau, is you can kind of make some predictions that if, in general, on your study areas, if habitat quality were a lot lower, meaning there weren't these developed understory plant communities like we had, you might have seen a greater effect because browse pressure on the remaining, the amount of plants would have been a lot greater, or just simply if deer density had been a lot higher, you could have seen a lot more browse pressure, especially from the herbivory and then also the trampling, etc. You could see a greater effect. So I guess just kind of filling in the gaps for people on the it depends. Those are some of the things it depends on, the type of effect you would see. Well, guys, anything else?
Well,
Hopefully we provided a little bit of context. We want to wrap up with anything else?
yeah, I did want to ask you, Bo, we were talking about the potential for plants to invade, and I know that you haven't formally measured some, after we moved the feeder, but you have gone and kicked around a little bit, you and some of the other graduate students. What are some of the plant species that you saw colonize?
yeah, so at one of our properties, we actually went back in this past week and looked at some of those fed sites, and before I kind of get into the actual species, one of the things that we noticed was you could tell that that's where the feeder was, and you could tell that plants were struggling to recolonize that area because there was still a lot of open ground. The plants that were growing on it weren't doing as well as their neighbors around them and things like that. So this is all kind of anecdotal just because we went back and looked at it and we didn't measure anything, but it definitely seemed like that, that is going to have a long-term effect in that area with that difference in soil composition.
So even a year after you've moved the feeders, you can still tell that's where it was.
Yep.
And then you're seeing some symptoms with the native plants.
Mm-hmm. But the two main species that we saw recolonizing that was, right in the center was a bunch of Invasive grass, and then surrounding that was Sericea lespedeza.
And are those good plants or bad plants, Beau?
Those are two pretty prominent invasive plant species that we see here in the Southeast. Especially Sericea can be a pretty bad one.
Yeah, and both of those are, the Invasive grass was originally, I guess, got here as a cattle forage, so it takes herbivory really well. And deer, I suspect, rarely, if ever, eat it. And of course, Sericea is one of those problematic plants that we're fighting all over the South and the Mid-South. And it certainly is not high preference and pretty browse tolerant as well. And it's one in particular that it's so extreme and I'll put on my nerd hat for a minute, but it's so extreme in the types of places that it can colonize and be successful. In fact, we brought it to put it in mine sites where we essentially turned a mountain on top of itself, and it's super acidic to the degree that we're down into the 4 pH range, 4 point somethings. So we thought that might be a good legume to colonize it because it can take that so well, and it actually is a soil degrader. It makes the soil worse as a competitive strategy, which is the opposite of what we would typically think of as a legume. So yeah, definitely a problematic plant, and one that we would not want to colonize. Were you seeing those plants around, and particularly the sericea? Were you seeing it around those areas before you had the feeding?
It was on the property, but it was not at that those fed sites that we saw it at. No.
So the feeder did seem to open up some space for it to colonize somewhere that it wasn't before you fed. Very interesting.
Well, Bronson, I think we've touched on the feeding question a little bit today, and I think our listeners probably caught the drift that there's a lot more to this, and we'll probably talk some more about this topic and its relationship to other aspects of deer management in the future.
Yeah, I wish it were as simple as to run an experiment and say yes or no. It affects the plant community or it doesn't. But of course it's not that simple. And this was a project done in one part of Mississippi. You could be in a different part of the country, and might have a differing type of effect. And then, of course, it depends on, like we've already covered, what is your deer density? How often are they using it? What is your plant community like? I mean, so many things are interacting here that we can't just definitively say yes or no. Of course, it depends. And that's kind of our anthem, it seems like, on this podcast is us qualifying, the it depends. And to hopefully help people arm them with more knowledge about this process and the potential unintended consequences of non-target species and degradation potentially of soil, and opening up some space for the colonization of invasive plants. I don't know if people have ever really talked about, those types of dynamics that may be going on. So hopefully we've helped people understand the system and the situation a little bit better. Marcus, thanks for joining us, buddy. Good to see you.
Yeah, good. Likewise, I really appreciate being here. Thanks for inviting me, and always great to talk to one of our great graduate students that's done such a good job collecting this data and putting it all together for everybody to learn from.
And Beau is now employed. I believe is it tomorrow, Beau, or the day after tomorrow? But it's pretty soon. So he's going to be joining the working world. And Beau, we appreciate all your work over the years. Friendship, and as a colleague, we appreciate it and look forward to working with you more in the future. So thanks for everything you did.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me on today.
Okay, everyone. I guess that will wrap it up, and we'll see you next time on Deer University.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.